to refuse or revoke a sponsor license where an organisation behaves in a way that is inconsistent with British values or against the public good. And I can tell you now that I plan to revoke Cage's licence on this basis, subject to representations. I will do all I can to ensure groups like Cage are not trusted with the privilege of sponsorship, and I will see it removed. Now, the third part of my approach is having the foresight to tackle the root causes of extremism before it takes hold. I know what it's like to be an outsider. I want everyone to have the opportunities that I had, to feel they belong to our brilliantly diverse Britain. But sadly, not everyone does. And that cultural separation can sow the seeds of extremism. The extremists are set out to fracture our society. Therefore, we must unite to defeat them. We need fewer labels that divide and more overlapping layers that draw us together. First, community. When people truly come together, we build unbreakable local networks that extremists cannot breach. Second, language. I saw how hard it was for my own mum when she came to this country speaking very little English. Now, we estimate there's 1 million people living here today that cannot speak English well or at all. And if we can't communicate with each other, how can we build bridges? So I'm making it my mission to ask for more money in the spending review to properly fund lessons and break down language barriers. Third, integration. A couple of years ago, I visited a primary school in my hometown of Rochdale where around 95% of the pupils were Asian. 95%. And only around a mile down the road, there was another primary school where around 90% of the pupils were white. If we want to see more social cohesion, we must rally against segregation and have a much more positive approach to integration. And finally, national identity. We must celebrate the qualities that define us as a nation. My parents were proud to choose to be part of this country, and I want to inspire that same passion in others, to encourage citizenship and a sense of belonging. Of course, I understand that there are some concerns about immigration. I get that. But loose language, it's used at all levels. You know, I'm from an immigrant family, and I know what it's like to be told to go back where you came from. And I don't think they mean Rochdale. Some worry that new arrivals will take over their communities and that our national identity will be diluted. I firmly reject that. I've seen how immigration can enrich our country, and I welcome it. I know how much immigrants have contributed to our culture, our economy, our society, our public services. Just this week, I was thrilled to meet 3 cricketers who helped win the World Cup for this country. One was born in Barbados, one was born in New Zealand, one was born in Ireland. All of them, all 3 of them, English heroes. I recognise the huge benefits of immigration. But if people from different backgrounds are living separate lives in modern ghettos, then it is no good for anyone. To be truly pro-immigration, we must be pro-integration too. And to do this, we must confront the myths about immigration that extremists use then to try and drive divisions. We know the scale is exaggerated to stoke up fear and that they use immigration as a proxy for race. Sweeping plans to cut immigration as if it's automatically bad can add to that stigma. You know, in 2015, a survey of school children found that the average estimate was that nearly half of people in the UK were foreign-born. That's what the school children thought. The truth, according to the 2011 census, 13%. A staggering 60% of the same group believed that it was true that asylum seekers and immigrants are stealing our jobs. 60%. I won't ignore that some people feel this way, but we must not be afraid to confront these issues and be honest and open in public debate. Only by talking about this, it's how we can show that how much integration enriches our communities. We all benefit because an integrated society is a strong one, where different cultures form layers of a watertight national identity, interlocking to form a united front that's so smooth there will be no footholds left for extremists. This multi-layered approach will help us tackle extremism. This is not just a job for government alone, but we will lead from the front, because it takes the whole of society to challenge these vile views. Everyone has a part to play. Broadcasters, who must not give platforms to extremists. Police, who must swoop in on the worst offenders. And public figures, who must moderate their language. And anyone can challenge the myths that are peddled by extremists that deepen divisions. So tell your friends, and shout it loud and proud, that people from minority backgrounds do not steal their jobs. They're not terrorists, and there is no global Zionist conspiracy. Extremism is a problem that isn't going to go away. So I'm here to redouble our commitment to tackle it head on. I will not flinch from confronting extremism. I will do everything in my power to stop those who seek to undermine our country. And I will tackle the root causes, to unite communities, to protect our fundamental values, and to protect those that are most at risk. I've made this my mission, and I'm asking you to do the same. Together, let's call out hate and unite our society and create a better, bolder Britain. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to take a few questions now. I've got some names here where I know these people have already said they'd like to ask questions, so I was going to start off with 3 people representing organisations and 3 from the press, and then maybe we'll have time for a couple more. So first, if I can just start with these people. Is there Victoria Gregson somewhere? Victoria, please, thank you.
Thank you. I'm a community coordinator, so I deal with counter-extremism at a very grassroots level. Often what I find is that this strategy is conflated with more securitised strategies. So what can the Home Office do to improve the public profile of this new strategy as its own standalone item?
Okay. Thank you, Victoria. Having been in the Communities Department and now in the Home Office, I absolutely understand the reason you asked that, because I've heard that before, and in the Communities Department, understand is much more about the focus about bringing communities together. And then in the Home Office, we sort of focus on counter-extremism, but also counter-radicalisation, and then that moves. There's a whole spectrum, and you end up with counter-terrorism, because extremism can lead to radicalisation that leads to terrorism. One thing that we did in government when I was Community Secretary and Amber Rudd had my job is that we agreed that we should coordinate much more within government to try and sort of manage the spectrum of threats. But you are right that we need to always be careful about distinguishing between what sort of action to integrate communities, which is just good in itself. The fact that people can speak English is just a really good thing. It can help you get a job, for example, and things. It's just a good thing. To counter-radicalisation, for example. So the PREVENT programme, which we run out of the Home Office. I think it's been a huge success. And sometimes there'll be some people that attack us on that, saying, well, are you calling these people terrorists or extremists? And actually what we're doing with something like that is that we are safeguarding young people. We're safeguarding them. And so all these programs will continue, but we're very much alive to managing this spectrum and making it clear about the different types of activity and what they're for. Thank you. Adrian Packer, please. Hello, Adrian.
Hello. Yesterday I attended a BSBT-funded event in Coventry with 92-year-old Holocaust survivor Harry Ulmer. The project, Echo Eternal, connects survivors with children from all sorts of different backgrounds and all ages. In paying tribute to Harry, the children at Bars Hill School in Coventry performed a piece of theatre inspired by his testimony. Bars Hill School is a diverse school where 120 different languages are spoken. The piece of theatre they performed relied on their common language, English, and in fact they used only one word, and that word was hope. So how hopeful are you that through projects like Echo Eternal, society can do more to bring our country together and help children from minority disadvantaged groups feel that they have a meaningful stake in the future of Britain?
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. I mean, that sounds wonderful, and I am very hopeful. I mean, today I've set out the threats, and for the reasons I've said, I think we need to be honest and confront them and recognise hate crime, for example. In particular, anti-Semitism has been on the rise in the last few years, not just in Britain, but throughout the Western world in particular. And then redouble our efforts to confront that. And one thing you just talked about, where you have a Holocaust survivor, Harry, going into a school which sounds like a big sort of multiracial school, people, lots of different backgrounds, and sharing his story. And I've seen that. I've been very privileged to meet a number of Holocaust survivors, and even for me, I can imagine the impact on children, but even for me, sort of knowing what I know, but every time I hear from them, I'm just humbled at what they say and what happened to them, and you just want to walk away from that thinking you can never ever let something like that happen again. And that is an example of how words, anti-Semitic words, in the early 20th century, they eventually translated into the gas chambers, and millions were murdered. And it shows you where extremism can lead if you don't confront it. And that's what this is about. And we support many organisations, and we're proud to support them, such as the Holocaust Educational Trust, with the work they do with Holocaust survivors both here, but also taking young school children to Auschwitz-Birkenau. And I've been on that trip myself with sixth formers from my constituency and seeing for themselves what's happened in history and why we can't repeat it. So I really commend that, but we support many programs like that. Johnny, please. Johnny, thank you.
Thank you, Home Secretary. My name's Johnny Newton from Community Security Trust, which, as you know, but maybe for the benefit of others, is a Jewish charity responsible for the security of the Jewish community and also for monitoring levels of anti-Semitism in the UK. As you do, CST considers anti-Semitism, wherever it comes from, to be an indicator of extremism in the same way that other forms of hatred can also be considered indicators of extremism. I'd be interested to understand how you see within any new counter-extremism strategy tackling anti-Semitism and other forms of hatred, is how important that would be in undermining any forms of extremism or all forms of extremism.
Yeah. Thank you, Johnny. And first of all, thanks to the CST for the incredibly important work that you do. We're proud to be partnered with you. And for those who don't know, CST, the Community Security Trust, is an organisation that exists to basically protect Jewish communities, whether that's synagogues or Jewish schools. And when I mentioned earlier in my speech that we have a protected place of worship program, this is an important part of it. It's not the only part, but it's a very important part of it. And I must say, while you raised that, is that one thing, when I first looked at, understood what CST was and that it existed, when I first learnt about that, and it does make you think that why do we live in a society where you even need something like that? The ideal world where we actually don't need CST. I mean, I don't want you to be out of a job, but you know, we don't need it because we don't feel that any community, because of their faith, needs any kind of special protection. But sadly, we do, and that underlines why we need to do more to, in this case, you know, particularly fight anti-Semitism. And the CST itself, you've done an annual report which shows, which sort of monitors rise, the change in anti-Semitic crime and incidents, and we've seen a very significant rise year after year. It's one of the reasons. So, for example, we updated our hate crime strategy back in October last year, both targeting anti-Semitism and, in particular, also anti-Muslim hate crime, where sadly we've seen a rise as well. And we will continue to do more. But when we set out in the new strategy, backed up by the research and recommendations we'll get from the Commission, we'll certainly be following through and trying to do much more. Good. Thank you. I've got 3 members from the media here to ask, and that is, I think, I've got Simon from Channel 4, then Angus from ITV, and Charles from The Telegraph. So I'll start with Simon, if I may. Simon. Hello, Simon.
You mentioned in your speech, sorry, sir, that politicians have in the past been part of the problem. Are you prepared today to condemn President Trump for his comments this week? And secondly, since we so rarely meet, wouldn't this be an opportunity, a moment, to offer an unqualified apology for the Windrush scandal?
Okay, thank you. First of all, on your first question, the US and UK are to the closest allies. I mean, they're our closest ally, and we always will be. And by being good allies, it also means you can be critical friends as well. So you're quite right to ask about the US, and I referred to it in my remarks earlier. You know, look, I am deeply concerned about the polarization that we're seeing in parts of the US, some of the naked populism that we see. And just yesterday, you may have heard yourself, there were chants of send her back. This is going on in the US today, send her back. Imagine if people were saying to me in Britain, send him back. Now, I know how I'd feel, but I'd like to think most of society would think that's just completely unacceptable in a modern, liberal democracy to have that kind of situation and not be appalled by it. So it's not something that I want to see or hear in the UK, and it's incumbent on all of us to fight prejudice in all its forms. And that then leads you into your second part of your question. I mean, I have unreservedly apologized for the Windrush scandal. I mean, I have done that. I'm very happy to say so again. It was wrong at so many levels. I mean, these were people that came to Britain to help Britain. We needed their help. They gave us so much. That generation continues to do so much for us. Yet they were very, very badly treated by successive governments. I've apologized on behalf of successive governments. Where I've talked, and we had the recent information after research, there are members of the generation that were forcibly removed from the country, deported even from the country wrongly by successive governments. And I think it's right. I'm Home Secretary, and I'm right to take responsibility for what's happened in the previous governments, and I will apologise for that. And I've written to all of those that have been the most affected, or their families. And I think it is absolutely right that when governments get something wrong, that we step up and we say it was wrong, and we learn the lessons to make sure it can't happen again. May I turn to Angus, please, for ITV.
Thank you very much, Home Secretary. Given that it's quite clear that President Trump was stoking up that chanting, would you go so far as to call President Trump a racist? And also, if I could, forgive me, also ask that many people working in countering extremism are funded by the public sector. What's the point of making headline-grabbing pay announcements if there isn't any extra money to actually fund public sector wage rises?
Okay. It's interesting how you connect those two. Your first question. I've responded to the question about the US. I think I've been very open about it in my remarks about some of the things that we're seeing in the US and how I don't like them, and I don't want that to happen here. The US remains and always will be one of our most important allies, and I want us to continue to have that really important alliance, but also be constructive and not be afraid to criticize if we see things wrong. As the Prime Minister have said when she's referred to the President's recent tweet, the Go Back Home tweet, as have the two remaining leadership candidates. And I think it's right that we are that constructive friend when we hear about things that we don't like. On the public sector pay issue, well, actually, I just take a bit of issue with what you said. I mean, it is properly funded. I mean, there is, as in, I know, for example, I'm not going to. I mean, this is a news report at this point, but let's just assume the news report was correct, that there are going to be these settlements because there hasn't been any government announcement. But let's just entertain it for a second. Then, I know, for example, if that was for the police force, 2.5% pay rise, I know police forces, they can fund it from their budgets because when we set budgets, we do try to, certainly in my case, try to take into account what might happen further down the line, later in that financial year. What also happens, of course, is when you have a pay rise, it resets the baseline in that sector. And it does mean, when a government accepts it, that in future spending reviews, that will be taken into account. I mean, that's obvious. And so if a government accepts it today, they're also implicitly accepting that in future spending settlements, it will be taken account of. And then I have Charles, please, from the Telegraph.
We've had segregation in schools for 20 years, if not longer. And it doesn't seem to have really changed in those 20 years. I know you've highlighted it, but what practical policies would you actually adopt in order to tackle that issue of segregation, which is fundamental, in my view, to integration?
Yeah, I do think it's fundamental, Charles, and it's important to point out, obviously it's self-segregation, I'm stating the obvious, but this is happening because if you take the two schools that I referred to, this is what ultimately parents are choosing to do from both, from all communities. It's not just driven by a single community. And when I've looked at this, and that visit I talked about, it was when I was community secretary. I also realised there's no easy answer to this. But I think there are some practical ways forward. It's something that I have discussed with the Education Secretary. Clearly it will be driven by that department, but I think it's something sort of cross-government that needs to be looked at. And as we do the work that I've set out today, because it is cross-government work, it's something that we will certainly try to see what can practically be done. It will take time to have change, but I think it's certainly worth looking at. Okay, thank you. I'll take a couple more questions. I will take gentleman there. Please, with the blue shirt.
My name is Shamaki. I'm from an organization called GOSAD, based in West London. And we have two projects at the moment. One is on FGM, actually working with men from practicing communities, and one on PREVENT. And actually, I was not intending to ask any questions today, but I think from the conversations and listening to some information about the commission, what the commission is doing, I think personally, I think something is missing. And what's missing is how the UK government reacts to international, like some of the questions been asked, and how people view how the government acts, and also foreign policy, because if you're putting any kind of strategy, it has to take into consideration. For example, we did a workshop on PREVENT, and a gentleman actually was asking a question about why Islamophobia hasn't been defined properly by the government, So if people from this community, for example, feel that the government is not maybe recognizing this kind of hate, then of course there'll be no strategy and there'll be no lesser work, for example, like the way anti-Semitism, which I think is a really bad thing that can happen in communities. So I think when strategy has been put together, it should look at not just internally how how the government should check this kind of things happening internally in the country, but there should be some kind of relations, for example, how the government reacts internationally. For example, we know there's a lot of like fake news and things like that, especially social media. So you have WhatsApp groups, for example, where people are posting, let's say, images of, let's say, the Israeli police, for example, attacking people and all that. So people change that, and of course it incites anti-Semitism, which actually it's a different thing, you know. So I think foreign policy and how, for example, the question about if Trump is racist, in the community people will say he's racist. But this has been avoided by everybody. So nobody wants, so all the answers are being given is that we've got good relationship, but then just using the word against the US president, it looks like everybody is not saying that, you know, from the government. So for me, it's just, yeah.
Okay, no, thank you, Shumaki. There's a lot there. Sounds like you're doing a lot of good work, especially you mentioned FGM, fighting FGM at the start, and thank you for that work. It's the work that we support. And I was pleased that earlier this year we were able to get the first conviction against a parent for forcing FGM on their child. You also mentioned Prevent, and I mentioned that before, but I'll just point out, it's an opportunity to point out, we are going to have an independent review of Prevent. I think it's good after so many years to have that sort of external sort of oversight and make sure that you're getting everything right. You also mentioned a definition of Islamophobia, and the government is looking into this whole area led by the Communities Department. But I'm pleased you raised that, because it sort of goes to the heart of some of the things that I'm talking about today, and that there is an all-party political group, it's called the APPG in Parliament, that's sort of come up with their definition. Fair enough, that's what they've come up with. But I don't accept the definition, because I think what it does is it confuses two different things. One is legitimate in that if someone hates someone solely because of their faith, that's completely wrong. It's completely unacceptable in every way. I've talked today about anti-Muslim hatred, where it's anti-Muslim hatred, anti-Semitism, anti-Christian. It's all completely wrong. You cannot not like someone because of their faith. It's completely unacceptable. But that doesn't mean it's wrong for someone to have not agree with a religion and say, you know what, I don't agree with what your religion says here or it says there. That's legitimate. That can be legitimate debate. So I think we've got to be very careful how we come up with what these definitions are. I think definitions can be useful. There's a definition, the International Holocaust Alliance on Anti-Semitism, which I think is an incredibly useful definition to get people very focused on fighting anti-Semitism. I think the same can also be done with anti-Muslim hatred, and that's why I'm pleased the Community Secretary has actually just recently set up a working group on anti-Muslim hatred, and got a number of people on that who are going to work together with the government to try and come up with a sort of sensible definition. I'll take one more, and I'm going to pick a lady. Yes, the lady back there. Yep. Please. Do you need a mic? Thank you.
Hi, Lizzie Dearden from The Independent. You called on public figures to moderate their language. Will you be repeating that call to Boris Johnson in the wake of his comparison of Muslim women to letterboxes, which we know from Tel Mama was repeated by racists in hate crime attacks on Muslim women?
I will. I think it is. First of all, I've talked about this before. I think it's incumbent on all politicians, that includes me, to be, as I've said today, clearly to be careful about the language and think carefully about the language that they use. But actually, you mentioned Boris Johnson, so let's talk about Boris Johnson. I am supporting Boris Johnson as one of the two remaining leaders to be the next Prime Minister. And actually, one of the reasons I'm supporting Boris Johnson is that I have always found him, both personally and how he has sort of acted, his policies and the things that he's talked about that he wants to do, to be someone that is passionately anti-extremist, passionately anti-racist, someone who is very comfortable and at home with modern Britain, indeed sort of celebrates and embraces modern Britain, And that is one of the reasons I support him. I think he would agree with all the kind of things that we talked about today about the need to fight extremism and racism in all its forms. Thank you all very much. Thank you.